Good morning and welcome to day 2 of our annual leadership conference, Ethical Dilemmas in the Digital Age. Today, the program of speakers and panels will be augmented with 2 sessions of our Ethical Leadership Challenge involving our conference attendees and the entire Corps of Cadets. These sessions will engage participants in a simulation of the problems of ethical decision-making in today's world. But first, I'm very pleased to welcome this morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Peter W. Singer. Dr. Singer is a prolific author of influential books on the new face of war and weapons of war in the 21st century. The Wall Street Journal has described him as the premier futurist in the national security environment. Of special interest in the context of this conference is his book, Wired for War, that examines the implications of robotics and other new technologies for war, politics, ethics, and war. His books, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know, explore key questions we all face in the cyber age, and Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next world war, is a fictional exploration of what the future of war at sea, on land, in the air, space, and cyberspace may be like. He is a strategist and senior fellow at the New American Foundation and the founder of Neoludite, a technology advisory firm. He is a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Communications and Informational Policy. He has consulted for the U.S. military, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the FBI, as well as advised a range of entertainment programs including Warner Brothers, DreamWorks, Universal, HBO, and others. Prior to his current position, Dr. Singer was founding director of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at the Brookings Institution. He received his PhD in government from Harvard and a BA from Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. Please welcome Dr. Peter Singer.
So thank you for the kind introduction, and it's just a great honor to be able to join all of you here at this place of amazing history, but also to be able to wrestle with the changes that loom before us. So as was mentioned, I work at a place called New America, which is a think tank. And if you're not familiar with us, we're a nonpartisan organization. We have offices in Washington, D.C., New York City, and Silicon Valley. And we work on topics that range from early childhood education to the future of the internet. Of particular interest to this conference, we've got 2 related but different projects. One is on cybersecurity, the other is on the future of war. And we're actually, like you, having our major conferences this week. They'll be actually tomorrow and the day after. You'll be able to follow them online. They're going to live stream on CNN.com and Defense One. And essentially, reflecting our sense of the network nature of both cybersecurity and the future of war, we've brought together a team that mixes backgrounds that range from technologists to policy wonks to members of Navy SEAL Team 6 to historians to ethicists, philosophers, lawyers, you name it. And essentially what my work in this group is on changes in warfare, as was mentioned, in particular the who of what warfare, whether it's the rise of private military contractors to robotics to you name it. And so they've asked me to speak to you about what looms when it comes to technology and war and geopolitics. What will happen next? Now, the problem of trying to predict what comes next is that if we're honest, we're not very good at it. So the best illustration I can give of this is actually from October 9th, 1903. The New York Times newspaper had an article that tried to predict the future. And it said, quote, "The flying machine, which might really fly, might be evolved by the combined and continuous efforts of mathematicians and mechanicians in from 1 to 10 million years from now." That was the best prediction in 1903 of how long it would take to fly. And in fact, that exact date that that article came out, those two brothers there began to assemble the first working flying machine in their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, the Wright brothers. Now, rather than throwing our hands up in the air and saying, the future's unpredictable, we shouldn't even try, which is actually a lot of people in the national security environment believe that, I would argue that while specific events in the future are not predictable, we can identify the key trends out there in the world that might shape the future worlds that lie ahead of us. So think of it this way. Imagine a tea kettle on top of a stove. With all of our advanced science today, we can't predict where a single molecule of water will be next in that tea kettle. We can send a robot to Mars that can twitter back at us, but we can't predict what will happen next with that single molecule of water. But if you're looking at that picture and you're trying to figure out, well, what might happen next, you wouldn't say, gosh, there's nothing I can do. You would ask questions like, for example, is the heat on in the stove? Knowing that if enough heat is applied to that tea kettle, you don't know when, you don't know where, but that water molecule will turn to steam. Now, it doesn't mean that's exactly what's going to happen. For example, your little brother can come along and knock over the tea kettle, and so it doesn't play out the way you expected. The point, though, is if you're looking at the system, whether the stove is on, heat is a key trend to pay attention to in projecting the future. Trends, they're guides. Nothing more, nothing less, but they're important to listen to. As John Naisbitt once said, quote, trends, like horses, are easier to ride in the direction that they're going. So before we jump into what's changing when it comes to conflict, we need to ground ourselves in terms of what's not changing. And that's the why of war. War, as it's been for 5,000 years, has always been driven by us. Our human failings, our human greed, our human anger, our human miscalculations. And of course, it also comes on us in terms of the costs. It comes in terms of human costs on the soldiers who fight in conflicts, those they leave behind, those who live in the places where conflict takes place. And I think this is, again, very important for us to remember in this current period because we too often don't pay attention. We don't ground ourselves in that way. So, for example, at the last GOP presidential debate that happened last week, the word Afghanistan was said 0 times. The word liar was said more than 20 different times. So we've got a disconnect in our body politic when it comes to the costs of conflict. Okay, so that's what's not changing. What about what is changing? Now, I would say there's roughly 3 major trends playing out here. When I say major, I mean major in terms of overall history, not just today or this year, but human history itself. The first you might frame as the what or how of war, the tools that we use, the technology that we use. A lot of you may be familiar with what this is a picture of. It's a picture of Moore's Law, the idea that we've been able to pack more and more computing power into our devices such that they basically double in their power and capacity about every 18 months or so. Now, what does that mean for conflict? Better illustration would be this, the Hallmark greeting card. If you, either gave or received one of those Hallmark greeting cards, say for Valentine's, it opens up and plays a little song. If you've ever held one of those in your hand, you held more computing power than the entire U.S. Army had when my father served in it, in that single card. And you likely didn't cherish it. You probably threw it away a couple days after Valentine's. That's the kind of changes that have played out with Moore's Law over the last 40 years. Okay, so what happens as we move forward? What happens, say, over the next 25 years? If Moore's Law holds true, we will see technology that is 1 billion times more powerful than today. I don't mean a billion in the amorphous way we talk about it, for the old Austin Powers movies, 1 billion. I mean literally a 1 with 9 zeros behind it. Now, Moore's Law is not a law of physics. It doesn't have to hold true over the next 25 years. It could slow down. Actually, last week had this kind of debate with U.S. Army one-star. He said, Moore's Law is slowing down. I said, okay, if it's slowing down, that's fine. What if technology slows down to a pace 1/1000th the rate that we've seen? Well, that means that over the next 25 years, we'll just see a mere 1,000,000 times the change. What it's leading to is a whole series of technologies that are playing out today that go by different kind of buzzword names. Some people talk of them as game-changing. Some people describe them as disruptive or revolutionary or killer apps. However you want to describe them, they're basically technologies that give you capabilities that were only imagined in science fiction a generation ago. And those capabilities offer up possibilities that you didn't think you'd have, but also relevant to this conference, dilemmas that you didn't imagine you'd have. That is, you get questions about not only what's possible, but questions about what is proper, issues of right and wrong that people a generation ago weren't debating, weren't wrestling with. And so what I'm getting at here is when you say game-changing, when you say disruptive, it basically means you get questions in everything from how you organize military institutions, businesses, marketplaces, to fundamental issues of law and ethics to figure out. Now, it feels very grandiose for me to say something like that, but I think we've been through this before, again, around about a century ago. So the period around a century ago, you had a series of science fiction technologies that became real, and then they had to figure out how to handle them. So one, for example, was what H.G. Wells came up with. He came up with the crazy idea of a land ironclad. So basically a battleship that went across the land. Winston Churchill read about this, thought this is a great idea, but we need to keep the secret. So instead of calling them land ironclads, when we're building them, we'll call them water tank carriers. And that's the origin of the tank. That's actually a picture of a young George S. Patton, who goes to West Point as one of America's greatest horsemen, and instead becomes a great tank officer. Or what about something predicted by this guy? Who's that? I'll give you a hint to who he is. The little boy that he's holding in his lap there is named Christopher Robin, and Christopher Robin is holding a bear named Winnie. That's A.A. Milne. A.A. Milne, creator of Winnie the Pooh, what does that have to do with war and science fiction? Well, besides writing Winnie the Pooh, he was one of the first people to conceive of the concept that he called a, quote, military aeroplane. And of course, we use it in war. And I show this to all of you, particularly for our friends here from West Point or the Air Force Academy. Once they recruited people to go to West Point by saying, you can learn how to fly. Those are the sort of changes that we've gone through. Or something conceived, again, by H.G. Wells, the idea of taking radioactive materials, bundling them together, making an explosive more powerful than anything we've ever seen before. He called this crazy idea a, quote, atomic bomb. And that helped influence the real-world people who created the Manhattan Project. So what are our comparables today? I was part of a project called Next Tech, and basically a lot like you would do in your classes, we tried to figure out what are the next changing technologies that will shape this world in this way. And so we used research methodology. Instead of just drawing them out of the air, we went around and interviewed over 60 experts, everything from scientists at organizations like DARPA, at various universities, at some of the top tech companies in the world, like the Apples and Facebooks, to venture capitalists, investors who are putting their money in making the future come true. And we asked them a very basic question. What do you think today is equivalent to the computer around 1980? It's real, it's not science fiction, but it hasn't yet changed the world, but you think it will. What's comparable to the computer in 1980? This is a word cloud of some of the things that they told us that they thought was equivalent to that. And they basically gathered into a couple of key categories. One is, again, a topic you've been wrestling with, which is overall hardware, but specifically robots. We've seen this change where our forces went into Iraq in 2003 with a handful of drones, unmanned aerial systems, whatever you want to call them. We had a handful in the air, none of them used in the operation, initially armed, and 0 unmanned ground vehicles, ground robots. We now have over 10,000 drones in the US military inventory, of course, many of them armed, and over 12,000 unmanned ground vehicles. And the US is not the only one. At New America, we have a project called World of Drones that basically documents, it's open source, you can go on and look at it, every nation that's building, buying, and selling drones. And there's over 80 in the list right now. In fact, Iran joined the club last week, carrying out its first armed drone strike in Syria. Now, of course, the impact of drones, though, is not just on battlefield operations, but how it's changed the way we think about war itself, where we've carried out more than 500 drone strikes into nations around the world that range from Pakistan to Somalia to Yemen, places we don't see ourselves as being at war. But again, 500 airstrikes, maybe we kind of are. We just don't think of it in the same way we used to. Now, that's where we already are with robots. What's next? Well, we're going to see a number of changes with them. One is the shift in their designs themselves, where the first versions of these, they were basically like manned machines sort of turned into robotic systems. Even on some of them, the cockpits was painted over. The way we talked about them was the same. Unmanned systems, a lot like horseless carriages rather than robot, automobile, or car, kind of describing the first generation by what it's not rather than what it is. So we're going to see lots of different forms. Also, because you start to realize that there's not a person inside of it, you can design in very different sizes. You don't have to design around the size of a person. But we can also get design inspiration from other areas. So for example, from nature itself. This is of a drone. Actually, if you guys can turn the sound off in the back for these. So that's a drone. Nature is one of the best scientists in the world, and now we're learning from it. It's not just, though, the idea of the design in terms of the hardware, it's also in terms of the software, things they can do more and more on their own. So, for example, you're about to watch a video of a robot take on what any Navy pilot will tell you is the toughest human pilot task, to take off and land from an aircraft carrier. This is a historic first of it doing it. And the key here is not just that it did it one time, it does it perfectly again and again and again and again. Something that maybe people moving into the Navy hoping to be top guns, you'll need years of training. This machine will now do it every single time. Now, this is just the start. As was mentioned, I have a project called Ghost Fleet that's a novel. It's a techno-thrill about war in the future, but it's crossed with nonfiction, so it's got over 400 footnotes. And in it, we document over 21 different examples where we're already working on autonomous robotic systems right now. So we had a great panel arguing whether we should. That debate is already over. 21 different cases already being worked on right now. Like, for example, this system right here, the Active, which is a robotic motorboat that will hunt down enemy submarines on its own. It's actually testing in Mississippi right now. To, of course, the other end would be swarms of micro drones. And again, 21 different cases, not me dreaming them up, but already systems being worked on right now. They all, of course, have parallels in the civilian world. When you think about, for example, micro drones and the work that not just the US military, but also Amazon's doing. So it's a great debate to have, but the technology has already moved past it. But the shift of robots doing more things for more people, smarter, more autonomous, is not just a story of hardware, it's a story of software. And that leads to another of these looming shifts in technology. And you can see this in all sorts of ways that you may be wrestling with. So, for example, one is the emergence of what they call the Internet of Things, where we go from using, iPhones to communicate to everything from our power grids to our cars to our refrigerators. things woven together. In about 5 years, it'll be roughly 50 billion things coming online. Another big shift in software is big data, where we bring it together to get new ideas. Another is artificial intelligence, where we're seeing what's called applied AI, or sometimes narrow AI, being used in everything from the autocomplete for when you're writing a text to being used in writing out tax code. That's soft AI. That's becoming ubiquitous around us. We're now starting to see moves towards what they call strong AI, which is basically equivalent to a human in lots of different ways. So, for example, Watson here has already beat the top human at Jeopardy, but oh, by the way, to the idea of let's not work on this, Watson has already competed for a Pentagon contract. Not an if, already in history. Another shift is in the weapons, but not in terms of the hardware or the software, but what you might describe of as waveware. So throughout all of human history, weapons use some kind of kinetic force, a fist, a stone, a bullet, physical force. When I was a little kid, I went to go see the first Star Wars, and when Han Solo comes on the screen and meets Luke Skywalker, Han famously tells Luke this, you need a good blaster at your side. In both the real world, some 30 years later, and in the storyline of Force Awakens, some 30 years later, Han is still wearing that same blaster that he shot first with, for the nerds in the room. He's still using it. We couldn't imagine that kind of shift. That's sci-fi. This is reality. Directed energy lasers are now real things. So, for example, this is a slow-mo of a test of a laser taking out a rocket in mid-flight. And they're not just being used in tests. This is the USS Ponce, which is deployed to the Persian Gulf right now. That is a laser on board it that is used to defend the ship against the threat of small drones and small swarming motorboats if it was attacked. So not an if, already deployed. And of course, it's not just going to be on warships that are lasers. There's programs now working to put them onto everything from trucks to the special operations just bought a plane that'll have a laser on board. Another key shift is not just in the tools, but how we make those tools. Think of it this way. So in the entire world of Star Wars, science fiction, they couldn't imagine it. In the original world of Star Trek, they couldn't imagine it. It wasn't until Star Trek The Next Generation, which comes out in 1987, that they come up with this crazy sci-fi idea of a replicator. Now we have what we call direct digital manufacturing, or more popularly, 3D printing, where you can take a computer design, a bit, and turn it into a thing, an atom. Now, what do we mean? What are some examples of how this matters to war? I'll give you 3 quick ones. Top corner there is the most popular police handcuffs in the world. In the yellow is the key, the get out of these handcuffs, sort of the universal key that unlocks them, that a German hacker stole the design of and put up online, and so now anyone with a 3D printer can make the get out of handcuffs free key. The other is the Wiki Weapons project, where basically you can make that gun at home. And the bottom is the SALSA project. A group of students, university students in Great Britain, wanted to make a drone. They wanted to make a better drone than the British military had. So they designed it in their computer, they printed it out with a 3D printer. To give you a sense of the size, it's about the length of these chairs up here. And then they flew it in 7 days, from idea to actual flight. And this is not just changing sort of the who, but also where you can make things. So the British Navy thought this is a really cool idea. So the SALSA drone, they then took it, they made it on a warship and flew it off the warship. So this is SALSA's first flight. So it was made on the warship, the drone, and then flew off the warship. Or another example of changing where is space. This is an astronaut holding a tool that he made in space using a 3D printer. Another shift is not in the what, the where, the how, but the who, better known as human performance modification. Basically, think of it as Iron Man meets Captain America meets Olympic athlete programs meets Daft Punk. So again, it's coming in all sorts of different forms. For example, genome sequencing has gone even faster than that Moore's law that seemed to be moving really fast. Actually, Moore's law is slow compared to it. Or drugs that affect everything from your concentration levels to how long you need to sleep, to your endurance levels, to the cross of hardware, software, and wetware, us, our human flesh. A couple examples like this, for example, is the brain-machine interface project at DARPA called BrainGate, which basically turns people's thoughts into digital signals that go out to control a computer. So it's been used for everything from, for example, helping this man who's handicapped. By thought alone, can't move his hands or legs, by thought alone, he's able to control a computer. He's able to write email, he's able to surf the web. It's also being applied into everything from video gaming to drone control programs, thought control of machinery. There's another program called Subnets, which is designed to do it in reverse. So instead of your thoughts going out, it turns digital signals to change your thoughts. So for example, it affects your memories, it affects your emotions. It was originally developed by DARPA to help with two things. One, people who have Parkinson's as a treatment for that, and also for soldiers that have PTSD. So you can reshape the memories that are causing them such trauma. Very positive development of this technology. As we explore in Ghost Fleet, and something again for this conference to chew on, every single technology has been used for both good, but also for bad. So in Ghost Fleet, one of the, we think, scariest scenes is the use of this technology where you can change people's memories to conduct torture. Another incorporation is back to a past trend, robotics, putting that in the body itself. So, for example, being used to replace things that have been lost, for example, soldiers who've lost arms to IEDs, but also, of course, to make us better, to performance enhance. So, examples like this gentleman who put a camera in his eye that can beam out to a handheld device what he sees, and of course to anyone else in the world. Or this gentleman who arguably has a better arm than we do. All of these things, though, open up new vulnerabilities. They give you new capabilities, but new vulnerabilities. So, for example, if you are an owner of a Jeep, or more recently a Nissan, you've heard about car hacking. Or all the things you put in your body opens up a new idea of body hacking. Or drones can be hacked. So for example, last week I was out at the, it's called RSA, it's the biggest cybersecurity convention, and someone was showing off that they could hack the most popular police drone in the world. So police are using it, someone showed off how they could hack it. What I'm saying here is all these different trends, all these new capabilities, all these new tools that seem like science fiction lead to a second big, major, historic, and I mean human history level change. And that's in the where of conflict. So think of it this way. When Star Wars, the original one, came out, and when I mean original, I don't mean episode 1. That's a terrible one. This is what the entire internet looked like in 1977. This is it. Literally, these are the 50 nodes in it. This is a depiction of the internet today, and of course it doesn't capture the complexity of it. But if you pull back, this shift has been amazing for not just communication and commerce, but conflict. In 5,000 years of human history, for most of it, we basically fought in two places: on top of the land, on top of the sea. And then we got science fiction technologies that took us to new places. And then we began to fight there. So one, for example, was under the sea for example, Jules Verne. And then World War I happens, and we're using submarines. And they're not just rewriting what we think we know about war at sea. So, for example, in the opening weeks of World War I, a single German U-boat sinks 3 British pre-dreadnought battleships. So everything that people had planned for how they would fight war is rewritten in that moment, in that single hour where that submarine sinks 3 battleships. Hold it now, war's not working out the way we planned. But also, they provoke deep ethical questions. Can you use a submarine to attack civilian shipping? If you can, does it have to operate in the old ways? It has to surface, put a flag up, board the civilian ship. But hold it, that takes away the advantage of having a submarine. This ethical debate, though, actually has strategic relevance. It's actually why the United States joins World War I, because we're so horrified by how the Germans are using submarines in this way. They're so violating the accepted norms of behavior. Okay? That just is not just part of our story of a rise of a great power, but it also illustrates another thing, how our thoughts about ethics and technology can change. Move the timeline forward. December 7th, 1941. You know how long it took us to change our minds about the ethics of using submarines to carry out unrestricted submarine warfare? 5 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack. 5 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the order goes out to our submarine fleet, carry out unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. So the thing that we had thought was horrible, why we had joined World War I, we're now doing, both because our comfort level with the technology has changed, and we're losing and we're pissed off. So think about this in terms of what technologies we will or won't use in the future, how we think about them today, but also we use this in the Ghost Fleet scenario. How will it be in different wars? Another example would be flying machines. I mentioned they were once science fiction. It's going to take us 10 million years to build them. We get them. And then you've got questions like everything from, do I need an Army Air Corps, or maybe I need an Air Force, to questions like, what is the home front now? And can I bomb it? And you get scenes like at the bottom, Picasso's Guernica. Just like what happened in the air and under the sea, we have a new space out there in terms of overall human history. And it comes out of science fiction. In 1982, William Gibson comes up with it. He combines the words cybernetics and space, and we get cyberspace. And we are fighting there. And the threat landscape has evolved. When you think about hackers, originally it was mostly, kind of individuals, often teenagers, in search of attention. Now the landscape is everything from transnational criminal networks to over 100 nations have some kind of cyber military command, like the one that General Alexander led, or his counterparts in the Chinese Third Department, to Ecuador recently created its own cyber military command. And then you have, again, the ethically but also strategically challenging groups in the middle, where sometimes they're criminal, but sometimes they're working on behalf of states. Or we have the example, and we consider acceptable, but other nations don't, private companies that participate in war. So we have the emergence of kind of the equivalent of cyber blackwaters, to university-based groups organized into militia. So we have this challenging gray space in the middle of private and public actors in cyber conflict. So what are the implications of it? Well, one is just how you stand in the physical fights of the future. These pictures here show you the same plane, right? Actually not. The one on the top is the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter. The one on the bottom is not the F-35 just painted black. It's actually the J-31. It's China's new Joint Strike Fighter. Now, either they look the same just out of sheer coincidence, or, as we document in Ghost Fleet, it's because that program has been hacked on at least 3 separate occasions, including one time when the F-35 was in mid-test flight. And it's not just a software issue, there's also a hardware issue here. What does it mean to go into battle flying, say, an F-35, where over 70% of the microchips in it are made in China. That's not just a supply chain issue, but again, for the sci-fi fans in the room, it basically opens up the possibility of the opening episode of Battlestar Galactica happening in reality, a hardware hack. We could also see cyber conflict manifesting itself in actual conflict. We've actually already seen this in new ways. So arguably, Ukraine lost its cyber war with Russia before its physical war ever began, because its communications networks were owned, both figuratively but also literally, by Russia. So essentially, Russia owns the networks, and when they decide to strike, they cut off access for Ukrainian military units. And so all the different Ukrainian units in the field suddenly lose communication. They aren't getting orders from their senior leadership. They don't know what's going on around them, and they're basically, in effect, isolated and then surrounded. But we're also seeing the direct weaponization of this space. This is a depiction of Stuxnet, and Kim Zetter from Wired is here, has a great book on this. And if you're not familiar with Stuxnet, it basically was a wonderful little device used to sabotage Iranian nuclear research. So it didn't steal information from Iran, it didn't block the flow of information like in that Ukraine case, it actually caused physical damage. It physically damaged their nuclear research facilities. That made Stuxnet new in two ways. One, it was the first digital weapon. So weapons in history have always had to do one thing: cause physical damage. Again, a fist, a spear, a bullet. Stuxnet did that, but it was digital. It wasn't a thing. It was a bunch of zeros and one in software code. First digital weapon. Second thing, though, Stuxnet was arguably the first autonomous weapon. Think about if Stuxnet had been a robot. It was given a program, it was given a target, and it was sent out in the world. No one remotely controlled it. It never communicated back. In fact, it destroyed itself after a while. It had a self-destruct. If it had been a robot, we would have described it as a killer robot. We would have described it as autonomous. It operated like a Terminator. Just because it wasn't a thing doesn't mean it's not autonomous. So it was the first autonomous weapon. Also, interestingly, while it was designed in this way to only hit one target, it popped up in 25,000 other computers in the world, everywhere from Belarus to India. So it was autonomous, it only caused damage to its one intended target, but it also didn't operate the way the planners hoped, which is a good lesson for when we think about the use of killer robots. The point is, pull back on this, in human history, just like what happened when we began to fight in the air or fight under the sea, we have all sorts of things to figure out. Everything from what's the best way to train, organize, and equip, to ethical questions about the proper or improper use of a cyber weapon, to big layered philosophic questions like, when does a cyber war begin? When does a cyber war end? How do you even know? And that takes us to the last and third big trend. We're not just seeing new technology, we're not just fighting in new places, we're in a new competition, both a geopolitical and technologic competition. So I'm part of a project Popular Science magazine runs called Eastern Arsenal, and we use open source intelligence gathering to track what is China doing when it comes to technology. Not just stealing technology, but creating its own technology, and it's doing amazing things. So for example, the world's fastest supercomputer, not US, Chinese. Or this little guy here is a armed Chinese ground robot shown off at a recent military trade show. Not a what if, an actual one. Let's stop talking about them as if it's something that hasn't happened yet. Or hypersonic vehicles, high speed. China's carried out more tests of them than the US military has. What's playing out here is not just this new technology, but a geopolitical story. The re-emergence of China onto the global stage. As Foreign Affairs magazine put it, the rise of China will likely be the most important international relations story of the 21st century. but it remains unclear whether that story will have a happy ending. It goes on to ask, will an era of US-Chinese tension be as dangerous as the Cold War? Will it be even worse because China, unlike the Soviet Union, will prove a serious economic competitor as well as a geopolitical competitor? Our question is, could it be even worse than that even worse? What I'm talking about is the idea that a Cold War could actually turn hot. As one Chinese military officer put it, quote, "We must bear a third world war in mind when developing military forces," end quote. And this is a Chinese media depiction of how such a conflict would go. They don't identify who they're fighting in it, but all you can tell is it's a really bad day for whatever nation operates Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and Aegis-class destroyers. And that's what we wrestle with in Ghost Fleet, is what would happen if there was a return to that 20th century style state-on-state conflict in the 21st century. Not saying it will happen, I'm just saying it is a risk that has returned. And that conflict could be something that starts by accident, or it's something that could start deliberately. And so just like back in the Cold War, we have to figure out how to prevent it, both through deterrence and through defense, to keep that kind of miscalculation or choice from ever happening. And there's a final wrinkle in all of this race, this new technology. It's who's in it and who will be the leader and who will be the follower. So let me offer you a couple final questions to chew on that are both technologic but also ethical questions. The last time there was this kind of race, the center of the American economy was Detroit. It was the arsenal of democracy. And so businesses were clearly aligned with nations. Today, the business environment is globalized. It's multinational corporations. And so companies have to navigate rivalries where they do business in both nations that are either rivals or even nations that are at conflict with each other. It's a different kind of dilemma. The second issue is when it came to innovation, it used to be government, the military led the way. It created ARPANET that then became the internet, and then the rest of us get it. Now that relationship is flipped. It's the private sector that's creating the innovation and government that's having a hard time keeping up. So you may have seen, actually just last week, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter went out to Silicon Valley to seek their help with technology, as opposed to the way it would have been a couple generations ago. So why does that shift matter? Well, I think it's changing all of the different relationships that are there. SecDef seeking their help, or if you think about the Apple FBI debate, it's the FBI trying to tell a private company what to do, and the private company and 25 of its even business partners and rivals all saying, FBI, shove it. These trends, to pull back in the end on, they're amazing, they're overwhelming, and like any ethical question, there's no simple, easy answer to them. So bottom line in all of this, it seemed like I was going to talk about the future, but I kept echoing the past in both history and even science fiction history. And that's because it's my belief that whatever the cool technology, whatever period in history, whatever dilemma, the best way to navigate it is to keep your eyes on both horizons, to pay attention at what's coming at you, so that you can, as Martin Luther King once put it, bend the arc of history in your direction. But also to keep another eye on the horizon behind you, to be able to draw lessons from the past, to know, as Mark Twain once put it, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Thank you. Thank you. So we've got time for some questions and conversation. Just raise your hand, I'll call on you, and wait for the mic to get to you. And when you get the mic, please stand and identify yourself for all of us. So any questions out there? Raise a hand, I'm looking around. Right here.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Cadet Morgan. You were talking about the game-changing technology. Now, could you name any of those technologies that could have the same level of impact, such as the airplane or the conical bullet?
So the technologies, you can get into specifics, but basically they fall into these 5 cluster areas of hardware, specifically robotics overall. And then within it, just like with the airplane, back if we were in 1914, would we say the airplane in general, quickly it's fighter planes, bomber planes, and the like. Same thing with robotics. Next is when it comes to the software, and software breaking out in particular to artificial intelligence, big data, autonomy. These things kind of morph and cross. Another key area is the waveware. So the idea of new things we're doing with energy, both in sourcing, but also in the weapons itself. And again, there's lasers, but there's other kinds of directed energy weapons that are working out there. Next is the idea of not the tool, but how you make it. So a good way to think about the impact of 3D printing is the parallel of Samuel Colt. So we're in a place that is kind of steeped in Civil War history. Samuel Colt, big matters to war, and people go, oh, you mean because the 6-shooter, right? And how revolvers are introduced around the period of the Civil War and the like. Actually, it's not because of Colt and the 6-shooter. It's because of how he makes the 6-shooter and how he essentially creates what we now think of as interchangeable parts and the assembly line. And so what Colt is able to do is make guns in a way that's quicker and better than the way they were doing it before. And he actually flips the entire manufacturing process and who owns it. So originally, the word arsenal was a place where the military made its own guns. So Civil War history, Harper's Ferry, John Brown seizes the arsenal there. The military used to make its own guns. That's what arsenals were. Colt comes along, and suddenly you can make them in factories a lot better. And arsenals become where you store the thing that the military buys from someone else. 3D printing, the ability to make that drone on your own warship, or make the spare part out at your forward operating base in Afghanistan, that changes potentially the relationship back, where the military is making its own gear. So big change. Also, tough question for the military to figure out. What happens if a savvy young lieutenant says, hold it, the widget that we're using here is really great, but if we altered the computer design, we changed it, this little angle by 30 degrees, it would be better. It would save us money. Who owns the intellectual property when they come up with this new invention? Is it the military? Is it the young lieutenant? And then we go, oh, well, they're in the military, so of course it's the military's intellectual property. Does the young lieutenant go, hold it, I've got a multi-million-dollar idea, maybe I ought to hold it for a while till I get out and then come back. What I'm talking about here is that it opens up kind of the same dilemmas that played out with the iPod and the music industry. It doesn't just disrupt the sort of production process, it gives you big questions about ownership that we're all trying to wrestle with. And the final big area is the wetware, is us, human performance modification, where we're using technology to change what we can do, everything from technology we carry on our bodies, wearables, monitoring, to technology that's chemically changing us, study drugs like 80% of college students have taken, and the military is trying to figure out, should this be allowed or not, to embedded in your body. Another question. We'll try and get someone up in the top rows. Way up there, yeah.
Sir, Cadet Williams, VMI. My question was about, so we've seen in Afghanistan particularly that counterinsurgency really requires that human interaction. So would you say that technology in the future is going to be about enhancing that, or is there going to be something different that we're going to see?
Great question, and a couple issues it touches on. So first is there's this kind of idea that the adversary, they aren't technologic, they hate technology, they don't use technology, and then there sort of gets to the next, and that's why they're thriving. That assumption, that description is just fundamentally wrong. You're not making it, but there's sort of this way out there, though they don't use technology, they avoid technology. Actually, a great illustration would be ISIS. ISIS has thrived because of its savvy use of 21st century technology, in particular, a panel that you're wrestling with later on, social media. ISIS beats out Al-Qaeda in sort of the brand to be #1 terror group because it's better at social media, whereas Al-Qaeda's still using kind of old school approaches. So too in its battlefield operations, it's made very savvy use of new kinds of IEDs. As an example, ISIS is flying drones right now, which throws out a really tough question. U.S. military hasn't had to think about air defense, particularly ground units, in several generations, and now we've got to rethink it. So one, insurgents, terrorists most definitely use technology, including cutting-edge technology. Second, we've got the mantra of, but it's the human interaction. It's the talking with people. It's the sitting down and having 3 cups of tea with them. Is that actually the case? The question would be, do we need to check our own assumptions? I don't know yes or no. All I can say is we've had that kind of mantra, and we've not actually won. And oh, by the way, the guy who wrote 3 cups of tea turned out to be a fraud. Third, there's the narrative that technology doesn't matter. This was an actual quote from a 4-star general. Technology doesn't matter in the human-centric wars we fight. That we don't use technology if we want to get it right. I would say, are you planning to fight naked and barehanded? Technology is just a tool, whether it's the clothes that you wear, the shoes you wear, or a predator drone. It's how you choose to use those tools. And do they warp your choices into relying on the tool too much in your hand versus the tool in your head? So my second point on our approach, is it actually winning or not? One of the things that what I'm getting at here is we need to figure out a balance between the lethality of our tools, but also our intelligence, and that intelligence is everything from human intelligence to emotional intelligence to understanding who's helping you, who's not, who's taking advantage of you or not. So I would sort of offer those 3 layers. Our solution set in this is not going to be easy, and it's not just a matter of either using or not using technology. We're definitively going to be using technology. It's actually how do we navigate those age-old questions of figuring out tactics, strategy, figuring out how to move among the fog of war, and most importantly, the politics of war. Let's try and give someone over on kind of this quadrant a chance. Any questions over here? One of the mic, I can't even see if there's any. So yeah, there we go.
Hi, Steve Hunter here. You didn't talk about a pulse bomb, since most of this technology relies on electrical energy. What are your thoughts about that?
So, so the EMP is the technology. EMP, it's fascinating. Afghanistan wasn't talked about, but EMP was in a presidential debate. EMP is the sci-fi cul-de-sac of national security discussions. It's one of these cool things that a couple of people have made a lot of money by tossing around the idea of the threat. It is, when you think about risk, you have to talk about likelihood and impact. It is exceptionally, exceptionally unlikely. So the idea of it is that essentially when we were doing nuclear tests back in the 1950s and 60s, they discovered a side effect that when the bomb detonated, it sent out this big EMP pulse that would kind of short out the electronics. And the fear, the scenario that's talked about in the debates is that, someone is going to detonate a nuclear bomb over the United States, and it'll short out all the electronics, including of these weapon systems. Okay, a couple problems with this. One, no one's actually done it deliberately in a test to know whether it works or not. So put yourself in the shoes of the adversary, whether it's Al-Qaeda or North Korea, and you've decided, you've finally gotten a nuclear bomb. So North Korea has it, but you're Al-Qaeda. You've finally gotten the nuclear bomb. Are you going to use it in the way that's never been tested deliberately to know whether it works? Or would you say, you know what, I'm just going to detonate the nuclear bomb on Washington, D.C. itself. So I'm going to maybe hope to short it out by detonating it in the air. I don't know whether it'll work or not. Or I'm just going to go the classic way and take out a city. That's the first challenge of this. The second is, in this narrative, it's sometimes treated as if it's different from nuclear bombs, as if we would react differently from the use of it detonating in the air versus actually on the ground. What I'm getting at is part of why once you get in a world of EMP, we're already in thermonuclear war. We as a nation are not going to respond to it by saying, oh, that was an EMP versus nuclear pulse. We're going to fire back nuclear weapons. So the things shorting out are the least of our problems because we're already in a world where nations are shooting nuclear weapons back and forth. So the scenario of its use on a grand level is a lot less likely than all of the other things out there. So that's why I don't talk about it, which is weird because on the other hand, it's one of these things that's been in huge numbers of Hollywood movies and books, and then therefore talked about in presidential debates versus more likely things. Now, there is the possibility technologically of conventional created EMP, where basically the difference of sort of the idea of shorting out the entire electrical grid for the United States, it's something that might short out the electronics within a small limited area, so smaller than this room. At that point, we're back in an area where it's not that fundamentally different than using conventional weapons. So I'm shooting a cannon shell at these people over there, sorry about it, and either I'm shooting it and it explodes, or I'm shooting an EMP one and it shorts out their electrical systems. Both effects, but we're not in a fundamentally different world. If it explodes and blows up their robots, or if it explodes and EMP pulses their robots, we're kind of in the same space. So EMP is not as much of a real scenario with thermonuclear, maybe likely in certain uses within a tactical setting, but is not a game changer in a tactical setting. Let's give another question, maybe somewhere in the middle here. And that's, I'm hearing that's our last question. So last question to fire away, anyone? Right here, right there, yeah.
Sir, Cadet Atosis from the Air Force Academy. My question is, how do we clearly define what constitutes a cyber attack while at the same time not limiting our capabilities?
Great last question, which we could then talk for multiple hours on. That question you asked is essentially at the center of national cybersecurity strategy right now in terms of trying to figure out not just when does it cross the line of being an attack, but when does it cross the line into being an act of war? So we are under kind of attack in all sorts of ways right now, everything from automated address scans to people carrying out political protests to people stealing information, conducting espionage. As an example, I don't know if he said it yesterday, but General Alexander in congressional testimony once said that every day America's armed forces face millions of cyber attacks. That was his quote. That's both true, but also not that helpful to your question, because millions of daily attacks, and the attacks are everything from, again, people carrying out address scans to trying to steal information to people trying to conduct espionage, but none of them are acts of war attacks, i.e. attempts at cyber 9/11, cyber Pearl Harbor, whatever kind of scary scenario you want to put on. None of them are in that, so it's kind of a big, big number, but it's a lot like me saying, my finger has millions of attackers coming at it, microorganisms, versus you really care, do you have the flu? At the end of the day, it's actually, I think there's two things that are going to stand out here. One is we'll define it, no matter the means, in the same old-fashioned way that we did previously. Basically, to be an act of war, it has to involve two things. It has to be political in nature, which distinguishes it from crime, and it has to involve violence. Someone has to be hurt or killed. There's never been a war that started over someone stealing information. But when it moves into that realm of violence and politics, then you're in the realm of war. But even with that, it gets to the second question, which is it's ultimately up to the president to decide, and then we don't do it anymore, to turn to Congress to say, does this meet the level of war itself? So there's been all sorts of things that are political and violent that sometimes we decide are not war, sometimes they are. So you could say, someone shooting across a border, that must be an act of war, right? Actually, sometimes we've had, in other nations, a nervous border guard. Actually, it's happened on our Mexico border. When one of our folks has gotten nervous and shot a rifle across the border, we don't go, we're at war with Mexico. Other times you go, okay, this is very clearly a war. So it's going to be kind of a debate for a future president to figure out. And then, to your last part of your question, once you are in the realm of war, you don't limit yourself by saying, I'm only going to operate in this realm. Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor using carrier airplanes, so I guess we can only fly carrier airplanes back at them. No, you're in a realm of war and you use all your tools, whether it's cyber tools, air, ground, land, sea. Same thing, it's that crossing into the realm of war itself that opens it up. So those debates, again, cross, I think what's fascinating in this conference, they cross politics, they cross technology, they cross law, they cross ethics, i.e., you can't give a very good ethical question unless you understand the technology, but just understanding the technology doesn't allow you to resolve the issue of the ethics of knowing when you're at war or not, what are the right decisions. So that's why it's been really fantastic to be able to join you all, and I wish you the best of luck with this event.
Sir, on behalf of General P and the Corps of Cadets, I would like to thank you for your time here today and extend this token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.